Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and with me is Bishop Barron. Bishop Barron, great to have you.
Always a joy, Brandon, to be with you.
Today we're going to try something a little different than usual. Every single episode we welcome one question from a listener. You can record your own question at askbishopbarron.com, and each episode we choose one to play here on the air. But we've been getting so many great questions from you guys that we decided we'd devote this whole episode to answering questions from our listeners. So we're going to take several of them somewhat rapid fire here. The first question pertains to Pope Francis's recent exhortation titled The Joy of Love. Bishop Barron has had time to read through the whole thing. He's shared his initial reflections. You can find that at thejoyoflove.com. But here we have a question about what major themes stood out to him. Here's the question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. I'm Milan, and I'm a student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I was wondering if with the publication of the new apostolic exhortation, The Joy of Love, if there's maybe one or several messages that you think are especially important, particularly to young people. Thank you so much.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that question. I've written a little bit on the exhortation, and people have focused, understandably, on the more controversial chapter 8, which goes into the internal form and all that business. But what's jumped out at me as I read it? And I read it in one fell swoop. I read it in one sitting, which has a certain advantage, I was struck by how thoroughly it reaffirms, confirms the classic Catholic teaching on family, on the importance and centrality of family, on the integrity of family life. It's very clear opposition, for example, to gay marriage, to any kind of transgender speculation. It's reaffirmation of Humanae Vitae, of John Paul II's Familiaris Consortio. I saw it as a great celebration of the classic Catholic view of the family. And I think we shouldn't overlook that. That's far more important, it seems to me, in the mind of Pope Francis than the issues raised in chapter 8. I also was really struck by I always call it the grandfatherly advice that he gives to married couples or to engaged couples. I think, and many priests I've talked to have suggested this, that we ought to just make that a prerequisite for all of our marriage formation. And I think that's pretty good. If we took that little section, actually pretty substantial section of Amoris Laetitia, and just gave it to all these engaged couples, or use that as a foundation for our marriage preparation. I love the section on 1 Corinthians where he exegetes Paul's great hymn to love. And take an engaged couple through that. What is love? And you'll see in Paul, of course, there's the root of the Catholic idea that love is not just a superficial sentiment, but love is this very deep and textured and complex reality. All the different modalities of willing the good of the other. That's love that's not, jealous, and love that's kind, and et cetera. So those three things, I would say, jumped out at me as really important, as you suggest, for young people thinking about marriage.
Today we're seeing the rise of the new atheists, Bishop Barron. We've done a couple episodes on this new atheism, which increasingly sees religion not just as quaint, but as something irrational and, even worse, something dangerous. So we have a question here from Frank, who asks, how do you respond to critics who think religions are violent?
Hey, Bishop Barron, it's Frank from Hoboken, New Jersey. I was debating religion with an atheist friend of mine recently. Even though I wanted to discuss Catholicism, he kept bringing up Islam and some attacks against it that struck me as a bit unfair. What resources can you recommend for a Catholic apologist who goes out to meet a culture that sees all religions as irrational and violent? I don't want Catholicism to be the next religion that becomes a four-letter word. Thanks, and God bless.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And boy, what a searching one and a difficult one. I'll say a couple things. The irrational dimension. One of the great marks of Catholic Christianity is a steady embrace of reason. And you see it from the very beginning, from the earliest church fathers, certainly through Origen and Augustine, into the medieval schoolmen, up through Ignatius and Newman, and into the 20th century and the great figures. Catholicism at its best has always affirmed the centrality of reason. Reread Pope Benedict's Regensburg address sometime about the Logos, The fact that Jesus is called the Logos matters enormously because he's not something opposed to reason. He's the very embodiment of reason. And therefore, reason should always be at the center of religious concern. Now, faith, as I've said a million times, goes beyond reason without superseding it, but goes beyond it, but never opposed to it. And so Catholicism, again, at its best, has always embraced reason. Have individual Catholic believers been irrational? Yes. And have done and said irrational things? Yes. But Catholicism as such embraces reason. Something very similar now with violence. See, here's what I'd say to the atheist critic. Name one human institution that is not violent. And, I would really challenge you, especially in the political realm, especially in the realm of modern political arrangements. The greatest violence ever perpetrated upon the human race was done not by or in the name of religion. It was done in the name of atheist secular states. And so the point is, human beings are a bad lot. We tend to be irrational and therefore violent. That's a question of sin. Christianity, I'll speak now just for Catholic Christianity, is not irrational. In fact, it embraces the Logos at the very heart of its concern. More to it, how can you argue that a religion that places the crucified Jesus at the very center of its concern is essentially violent? No, what you see there is God's absorption of violence. If you want, it's the divine putting an end to violence through merciful love. That's the heart of Christianity. I mentioned, I think, in the last show, I've been watching this program on the Vikings, and that wonderful scene when the Viking raiders come upon the Lindisfarne monastery, and they burst in and they see the Christian monks who clearly are worshiping this image of a crucified man. And these violent men are bearing arms and they say, what in the world? I mean, how could you be worshiping this crucified criminal? And of course, there's the whole poetry of Christianity. And so it's nonviolence. It's merciful love and forgiveness that stands at the heart of Catholicism. Have Catholics been violent over the centuries? Of course, that's because we're human, and human beings are a bad lot, which, by the way, is essential to our teaching. It's called original sin. And so I'd say to the critic, name one human enterprise that is not marked by irrationality and violence. Don't heap the blame on religion. But then look honestly at what Catholicism is in its heart meant to be. It's supremely reasonable and supremely nonviolent.
You're listening to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, and I'm here with Bishop Robert Barron. We're taking questions from our listeners in this episode. Every episode we take one question, but we've devoted this whole entire episode to questions from listeners like you. Next up is Tim. Tim is a freshman in college, and he's looking for some good book recommendations. So here's Tim.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Tim Ross. I live in the Woodlands, Texas. I'm a freshman in college and going to be double majoring in philosophy. And my question is, what are some good Catholic philosophy books that are easy to start out with? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I got into this whole operation through philosophy too, so I've got a great affection for it. I guess I can answer it a couple ways. One is to look at classic texts from the great tradition that are, challenging, but I think relatively accessible. One that I love, and it was my hero, Robert Sokolowski, told us to read it every year of our lives, is the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle. One of the truly great texts in Western literature and Western philosophy. And I think a fairly accessible text. So the Ethics of Aristotle. I'd also, most Philosophy 101 classes begin with the early Platonic dialogues, the Euthyphro and the Crito and the Phaedo and those. And I think those are great because they're very winsome, they're beautifully written, they're psychologically perceptive, and they're making such fundamentally important philosophical distinctions. So I'd recommend those early dialogues of Plato and then the Ethics of Aristotle. Something a little more technical, but boy, is it a masterpiece. The very young Thomas Aquinas, no more than about 24, writes a text called the De Ente et Essentia on being and essence. And there's no better text in all the Middle Ages to lay out how the medieval schoolmen took in the classical Greek philosophical tradition and applied it to the questions of being. It's wonderfully lucid and clarifying. And it's how the smartest guy of his time was looking at the structure of reality. So we tend to use the scientists today, of course, and we look at Stephen Hawking and those people. But in the Middle Ages, they looked to the philosophical tradition. And there's no better presentation. It's very short, too. You can read it in one sitting. The De Ente et Essentia of Aquinas. For more contemporary things, accessible things, I still love Copleston's little book just called Aquinas, if you want an intro to Thomas Aquinas. I mentioned Sokolowski. Get his still wonderful The God of Faith and Reason. No better introduction to that complicated issue. Also, Sokolowski's Introduction to Phenomenology is such a beautifully lucid text on a notoriously difficult topic. But, to get the 20th century in philosophy, you've got to get phenomenology because everybody is a disciple of Husserl in the 20th century. From Heidegger to Edith Stein to Dietrich von Hildebrand to Jacques Derrida and Jean-Luc Marion and Emmanuel Levinas. They're all Husserlians. There's nobody better at getting into the mind of Husserl than Sokolowski. So get his Introduction to Phenomenology. I like Peter Kreeft's books, his Summa of the Summa and his books on philosophical topics, I think are very fine for getting into it. Also, someone like Kreeft, I think, is Josef Pieper, the great German Thomist. Get his books on the virtues. Get his book called The Silence of St. Thomas. These are very fine. In fact, Karl Rahner, the great Catholic theologian, was asked one time, whom would you recommend to young readers? And he said Josef Pieper. And I think that's a very fine recommendation.
Next up, we have a question from Brad. He wants to know how your familiarity with multiple languages has helped you in your work.
My name is Brad, and I'm from Michigan. Bishop Barron, you're fluent in French and have some reading and speaking knowledge of German. How has being multilingual played a role in your own faith life and in your ministry? Has it helped you understand and apply concepts or teachings in different, unexpected ways?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I've always loved languages. I love the English language from the time I was a kid. I studied Latin when I was in high school. I'm grateful to my father, who told my brother and me, take Latin. And we had this wonderful old Dominican priest teaching us Latin. And boy, talk about God's providence. I have any idea when I was 13 years old taking Latin class that I would use Latin for most of my life, and my doctoral work in Thomas Aquinas was all in Latin. So the beginning with Latin, I think, was really good. I studied French when I was in college, and then that followed through to my doctoral studies in Paris, where I lived in a French-speaking house and took all the seminars and courses in French, and that was a joy. I studied Spanish too as a young man in the seminary, and I lived with a Spanish-speaking couple for the summer. Took intensive courses, so I got Spanish in the back of my mind. Now I find, in my 50s, I'm a bishop in Southern California, and I have a tutor come in twice a week now helping me with Spanish. Just last night, I was using it extensively at the confirmation mass. German I studied when I was in Paris. I took courses in the Goethe Institute in Paris. Then I spent a wonderful season, about 3 or 4 months, in Freiburg and Breisgau, and I worked with the Goethe Institute there. And then my doctoral work was in Aquinas, so Latin, and then Paul Tillich, the Protestant German theologian. So I worked in both Latin and German. So yeah, I've had a great exposure to languages. A little bit of Italian. I just love it, the sound of it. I don't know it well at all, but I spent 2 long sojourns in Rome as a scholar in residence. So I learned a little bit. I'd read books in Italian. But so the answer to your question is yes. As an academic, obviously, it gives you access to lots of things. I remember Cardinal George, my hero, saying that when he was a young man and he was learning all the languages, it was such a liberating feeling to walk into a great library and think, I could open all those treasures, all those books in the different languages I can read now, and it opens up the whole tradition to you. From a practical standpoint, I ministered a little bit in French when I was over there. German, I said Mass once or twice, not a lot. But now Spanish, I'm using all the time in a pastoral setting. So to me, that's been a great gift. I'm not at the Wojtyła level, people that have these extraordinary gifts for language. I think I have sort of moderate gifts for language. But it's been a great joy, and it has indeed helped me to open up all kinds of worlds.
Once again, this is the Word on Fire show with Bishop Robert Barron, and we're taking questions from listeners like you. If you have a question, please record it and send it to us by visiting askbishopbarron.com. Next up is a question from Michael. In Pope Benedict's exhortation, Verbum Domine, the word of the Lord, the Pope spoke about the dark passages of the Bible, and he encouraged pastors to speak on these dark passages and help people to pull out understanding from them. So Michael asks about some specific passages in the book of Psalms.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Michael, and I live in Brooklyn, New York, a proud member of St. Francis Xavier Parish. Jesus Christ commands us to love our enemies. How should Christians interpret the Psalms, which routinely include prayers for our enemies' downfall?
Yeah, thanks for that. And, Brandon, you're right in highlighting Pope Benedict's call to wrestle with these passages in the Bible. And I've done that in different ways over the years. And there's no univocal answer. There's no like just one quick way to solve the problem. But let me shed light from one angle now on the Psalms. It would be wrong simply to read the Psalms word for word as divine prescriptions. So God is clearly sanctioning everything in the Psalms. What do you find in the Psalms often are people expressing their passionate feelings about a whole variety of things. You have people in profound depression. You have people who are angry. You have people who are oppressed by their enemies. You have people that are giddily happy. You have people who are coming into the temple with great joy. They're all in the Psalms. They're all in the Psalms, the full range of human experience, human emotion, and all of it's being brought to God. Now, does it mean that God is sanctioning everything that's being expressed in the Psalms? Well, no, of course not. So someone is saying, Lord, smite my enemies. Well, yeah, that's the way that poet, that prayerful poet felt. And he's expressing this now with great passion before the Lord. Is it a good prayer? Good, yes, in the sense of it's expressing his feeling before the Lord. Is he asking for the right thing? Well, that's not necessarily the case. Some of the psalmists are asking for things that maybe aren't that good. But yet the church has preserved these great prayers because of their spiritual power, So I wouldn't just univocally say everything you see prayed for in a psalm is something that God wants or God sanctions. God listens to the psalms. We often feel the same way the psalmist feels. So as a priest, again, I have to pray the office every day, and it's largely from the Psalms. And so I know the full range of experience, feeling, passion that's expressed in the Psalms. And I would say, yes, I felt all of those feelings at different times. That when I'm sitting there in front of the Lord and I'm so mad at somebody and I'm so angry about what happened to me, and Lord, if only you would just smite those people. Okay. The psalmist and I can pray that together as an expression of our, feeling. Is it sanctioned by God? I would say not necessarily.
A couple episodes ago, we devoted the whole discussion to a book that you wrote a few years back that was recently re-released. It's called The Priority of Christ. And Jaron has a follow-up question to that episode.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Jaron, and I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. In a past episode of the show, you talked about the primacy of Christ. In the modern world, we tend to treat personal experience as the ultimate reference point for understanding things. My worry is that by making Christ my absolute reference point, I would have to sacrifice my intellect in order to do that. Could you explain if this is the case or not? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And in some ways, that whole book that Brandon referred to is an answer to that question. Here's a quick take on it. So you say correctly, I think, that a lot of people today say personal experience is the right point of departure. Who said? Who privileged that? And I know it goes back to Descartes and people like that who made that move. But who died and made personal experience the criterion of truth? Jesus, in fact, is referred to as the Logos, right? As reason, the very incarnation of God's own mind. And so to claim that Christ is anything but a reasonable or rational starting point would be self-contradictory. The book by Alistair McIntyre called Whose Justice, or is it Which Justice, Whose Rationality? It's a very searching book, and the title is very provocative because there's an Enlightenment prejudice that the Enlightenment form of reason, and you're picking out a feature of that, right? That it's the Cartesian move, that personal experience, subjective experience is the proper starting point. Well, that's a prejudice. That's one way to do it. That's one approach to it. But there have been all kinds of different instantiations of reason, different accounts of reason. I was just recently reading the great masterpiece of Origen called the Periarchon about first things. And Origen claims over and over again to be the voice of reason. He's proud as punch about being the voice of reason. And yet Origen says these things that I love him, but I mean, some really wacky things come out in this book. And you think, wow, that is so irrational. They didn't think so. Thomas Aquinas certainly would claim the mantle of reason in the Middle Ages. Voltaire in the 18th century would certainly say, I'm the avatar of the age of reason. Stephen Hawking today would probably say, oh, he's the voice of reason. My point there is there are different accounts of reason. What does it mean to be rational? Well, there's an Enlightenment, Cartesian, Kantian approach to reason, and part of that is the appeal to experience. What I was trying to do in the Priority of Christ is, in some ways, dethrone all of these false claimants to the one high ground. I'm what it means to be reasonable. No, there are a lot of different accounts of it. And there's nothing irrational about saying Jesus Christ is the proper starting point of a reasonable approach to life.
Our last question here comes from Dan. In light of all of your great success in ministry, Bishop Barron, Dan wants to know, how do you maintain a spirit of humility?
Hi, Bishop. It's Dan from Pensacola. And my question is that as you see your projects and your career really start to take shape and to make a difference, how do you avoid the pitfalls of egotism or self-righteousness? How do you proudly accomplish so much but also maintain a genuine humility? Thanks.
Well, I guess he's assuming I am maintaining a genuine humility. No, that's a good question. And I'm with you. I understand that. It's the shadow side of anyone that wants to go into the kind of work I've done, in broadcasting and teaching. And, Fulton Sheen, I think, is a very saintly figure, but people often say he wrestled with that. And you understand it. Of course he did. He's in the public eye all the time, receiving adulation. He's on radio, television, widely admired. And he wrestled with that. Of course he did. Of course he did. And I know it's a shadow side. It accompanies any kind of public ministry in the church. I guess all I can say is prayer. Every morning I go to my chapel and I try to spend an hour in prayer. I pray in my office. I say Mass. I attend the sacraments, including confession. I think those are the ways that you keep grounded. That's the issue, I think, is being grounded, that you're doing it for Christ, not for your own advantage, not to aggrandize your ego. You're doing it for Christ. And you'll do it as long as he wants you to, I mean, I fully realize, heck, I'm not young anymore, how many more years will I do this? Will I be healthy for how much longer? I don't know. Will my ecclesiastical superiors allow me to do it? I don't know. Am I becoming a bishop? That was completely surprising to me. We've continued Word on Fire, but it's only because my current ecclesiastical superior is allowing me to. So I think all those things are good and natural ways to hem in the danger of an egotism. I mean, one thing I would say in regard to priests is whenever you're operating outside of all those strictures, you got problems. I remember, again, I'll invoke my hero, Cardinal George, who said to me one time, "You're not a guru, you're a Catholic priest." And he wasn't really accusing me of being a guru. It was like his way of just reminding me, you're not a independent operator, sharing your own point of view. You're a Catholic priest. You're a priest of the Catholic Church. I think when those things are in place, it's a natural check to the danger of egotism. If you start operating outside of those, that's when trouble comes.
We'll close here with one question I have for you, Bishop. We know that a lot of our listeners are big fans of your book recommendations, and you told me before the show that you had some more time recently to get into some deep reading. I know you mentioned the Origin book you're reading already. What other things are you reading right now, and what would you recommend?
Yeah, no, thank you. One thing, the last 4 years of my life when I've been drawn more into administration, when I was rector of the seminary, now bishop, is I have less time for that kind of really deep ruminative reading, which I love, love, love to do. That was my life for so many years. The other day I went to there's a very cool bookstore not far from my house in Santa Barbara called the Chaucer Bookstore. And it's a good old fashioned bookstore, which are largely disappearing. And I love Amazon. I use it all the time. But because of Amazon, those great old bookstores disappeared. This place smells like a bookstore, big high wooden shelves packed with books. So I go into the religion section, and they had a good selection, including this new edition of the Periarchon. That's the Greek for, the Latin is the De Principiis, which means about first things. It's Origen's masterpiece of dogmatics from the 3rd century. And in fact, the magazine First Things took its name from that, from the De Principiis. Anyway, there was this new edition of it, and I thought, I read at it years ago, read about it for a long time, but I've never actually plowed through the whole thing. So I bought it, and I must say this past weekend I've read, I don't know, maybe 150 pages of it, and love it, love it, love it. Really interesting, wacky, wonderful, a little crazy, deeply insightful, all of it at the same time. So I've loved that. The second book I'm reading, and it's sort of deep background preparation for the Erasmus lecture. So in 2017, I've been invited to give the Erasmus lecture, which is sponsored by First Things, and it's all about religion and public life, So I'm reading a lot of different things. I just finished a little book on Tocqueville, and this one is called The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, a book I've heard about for many years, never read it. And boy, is it good. It's a survey from Edmund Burke, late 18th century, all the way up to Kirk's time, which was the 1950s, and looking at what can be identified as the conservative movement. What I want to do is read that book and then read Martha Nussbaum's reflections on liberalism, because she's probably the smartest liberal on the scene today, articulating what liberalism means at a high philosophical level. And I want to read those two books and just use it kind of as a matrix for musing on Catholicism in relation to these two movements, Anyway, I'm bazooing here, but that's a book I was reading too this weekend and really loving it. I'm heading off to Sacramento for the California Catholic Conference meeting, so I'll be on a plane, and planes are great for reading. So I'm going to bring, one of those two books probably.
Well, thanks again for listening to the Word on Fire show. We hope you enjoyed this episode, which featured a lot of questions from listeners like you. If you have a question, again, please visit askbishopbarron.com and record your question. To find extra resources on all of our episodes, you can go to wordonfireshow.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.